In this episode, I will be designing and building my first jet aircraft of this campaign, with the goal of breaking a 15-kilometer crude altitude record. Along the way, the whack Corporal will fly for a third time on a science-gathering mission. I will also be discovering that a growing space program comes with additional challenges managing staff. I will be hiring my first leader, and during my jet mission, find out that jets in RP-1 aren't quite as straightforward as they are in the stock game. Let's get started. Cracking the Carmen line last episode opened up a lot of options for me. Before we get started, there are some decisions I need to make, starting with contracts. I now have available a total of 8 contracts, 4 in each of the programs I have active, though 4 of them are optional, like these downrange distance LV development, intermediate, and difficult contracts. These look fairly involved compared to what I've done so far, requiring a specific amount of sounding payload to be carried to an altitude of over 140 kilometers, as well as downrange a specific distance. It says here that the reward for this contract will slowly increase over time, but will reset to 0 after each completion. Current reward is 100% of its nominal value. Elapsed divided by expected days is 135 by 135. I'm not completely sure on this, but it seems the idea is that you can repeat these contracts over and over. I'm assuming as long as this program remains active. So I think as long as I don't finish off the last contract in this program, I can come back to these. I think I'm going to aim a little lower instead though. With the first contract in the Suborbital Rocket Research Program, first low space film return, which requires me to take an early film camera above an altitude of 100 kilometers and cover a downrange distance of 200 kilometers and then return the camera safely. Unfortunately, said camera has a diameter of 2.5 meters and my little whack Corporal rocket is only 30 centimeters across. So this is going to require the building of a completely new rocket, which, of course, is going to take some time to build and thus will be a topic for a future episode. Note, though, that as soon as I accept this contract, all the others become unavailable. They make you bang these off one at a time. I also have 9.6 science, so I might as well start eyeing some more tech nodes. Remember, these don't get unlocked right away, but have to be researched over time. I'm already researching early tracking systems, and after some consideration I added post-war materials science, which upgrades my tanks, provides service modules, and increases the efficiency of my launch complexes. Post-war rocketry testing, upgrading my rocket engines. Early solid rocket engines, and finally supersonic plane development. Again, don't expect this tech too soon. They each have to be researched one at a time. These green and yellow circles confused me at the time, though looking at this while editing the video I can see they reflect the rate at which these nodes are being researched. I then went into the admin building to pick a leader. Vladimir I'm gonna butcher names. Chelemy. Hire Khrushchev's son, so minus 15% confident cost for program activation. Plus 5% speed launch complex efficiency gain. Speed of launch, okay. Minus 7% reputation from contracts because they had no support after Khrushchev. Engine design genius, minus 15% costs on researcher salaries. Plus 5% reputation from contracts. I don't know if that's good because they're a hero of the Soviet Union. Valentin Klushko. Turned in Korolev. Plus 10% reputation to remove an existing leader. Oh, nice. So if you take away... Oh my god. He's a backstabber. Minus 12% funds on salary costs. Plus 5% reputation. A cautious... Minus 5% funds from program funding. Okay. And now we got the Americans. Milton Rosen. Plus 10% speed of researching all technologies. Ooh, I think I like that right away. Plus 10% confidence from science. Tight deadlines, minus 20% time from program deadlines. I think I'm doing fine with that. And tight deadlines part 2, minus 20% funds from programming funds. Ooh, wow. But despite those penalties, I do like the science boost, so after looking at the remaining 2 leaders, I did decide to make Milton my first director of administration. Next came the designing and testing of that V2 rocket, which, more likely than not, will be the topic of the next episode, but I'm bringing it up now because it did impact this episode, as the size of this rocket required the construction of a brand new launch complex. Just renovating the first launch complex wasn't going to cut it. I'll talk about this in more detail when we explore the V2 build, but for now, just know it's going to take 86 days to build this thing. I also have 10 new applicants to the Space Center, another reward for crossing the Kármán line last episode. From this pool, I hired 3 additional researchers and 7 engineers, bringing me up to a total of 10 researchers and 20 engineers. Hopefully, that's a good ratio. Either way, none of those engineers can be assigned to Launch Complex 2 as it is still being built, so they got split between the hangar and Launch Complex 1, which I only then realized has a maximum staff count of 10. I also fiddled with the order the tech is being researched in, pushing up the post-war rocketry and supersonic plane development to 1 and 2 on the research queue. Though I realize now it would be better to push up those green ones as they will be researched faster. I'll have to remember to do that for the next episode. Which finally gets all this administration stuff out of the way, leaving the road clear to the inaugural flight of my new jet. But on the way to that being built, the engineers in Launch Complex 1 were able to push out my third Whack Corporal sounding rocket. Alright. Nice. Again, going straight up. This is just for science. There's not going to be any contracts associated with this. And as this is an identical launch to the one that cracked the Kármán line last episode, I won't be spending a lot of time with it. But this rocket is cheap to keep launching, even when you figure in the staff and facility costs of the launch complex. Once again, there is no science to collect until we reach an altitude of 40 kilometers. Alright, good. Again, no failures. I've been pretty lucky on that front. Okay, we can start time work. So we got data being collected. There's not a lot, like Kerbal, we do get the, put that back, temperature data. Yeah, we are currently flying, the temperature is biome specific. Flying high over the forest. So we're collecting that. We're 40%, but we won't be done the temperature scan. Okay, the telemetry report looks like it's done. So looks like that. How do I get the telemetry? Telemetry analysis. I don't know why it does that sometimes. There we go. So it's not biome specific. There's only 2 units of stuff there. So that is done on that front. And then the other one we got, so telemetry is done. Might as well just remove that after this is over. Pressure scan is the other experiment that's being performed. Not biome specific. It's collected. 60% complete. Yep, there's 1.5 science and R&D, but still 1.1 science left to collect. Takes a total of 10 minutes to collect all this science, and by the time we were back under 40 kilometers, we were up to 80% complete. One more launch ought to finish the pressure scan off. I do love this science archive window from Kerbalism. It really satisfies that completionist itch that resides within me. Immediately after this launch, I began construction on the next Whack Corporal, but this time tilting the rocket north by northwest, with the hope that it will pick up some additional biomes with that temperature scan. However, tilting it over resulted in more strain on the tail fins, which soon became destructive. This was rectified by just turning up the strength multiplier on the tail fins to 0.2%. Of course, once I was happy with it, I passed it on to my engineers to build, leaving the road clear for the first flight of my jet. Before we get to that flight, let's cut back 5 months and spend some time with the build. A couple of things before we get started. First, there is a perfectly serviceable out-of-the-box jet trainer that comes with RP-1 that you can just use. That said, I rather wanted to build my own jet, perhaps learning a few things along the way. To get me started, I looked at the engine, the Derwent turbojet, and went online looking for some inspiration. This is the Mark V version of the engine, so I'm looking for a plane that used that version and soon found this, the MiG-15, which first flew in 1947. Strictly speaking, this didn't use the Derwent 5, which was built by Rolls-Royce and used in the British Meteor jet fighter. But the government of the time also sold the engine to the USSR, who reverse engineered it and put the result into the MiG-15. For me, the MiG looked easier to build than the Meteor, so here we are. I also want to mention that this isn't my first plane of this series. In episode 2, I designed and flew this little prop plane, which I did talk about in some detail. As such, I will be going over this build a little more quickly, especially when it comes to details of using things like the procedural wings and control surfaces. And with that, let's get started. The build started with the P-40 cockpit, which has a crew capacity of 1 and, like all these starting tier cabins, is unpressurized, so don't take it above 16 kilometers if you want to keep your crew healthy. For the air intake, I chose the XM-600 1.25 meter pitted intake. The only reason being that it sort of looked like the one in the real world MiG, and also that you can see it spinning. Likely the smaller intake would have been more appropriate, but I'm living with my choice. It was a little tight to the cockpit, so I separated it with a procedural structure part, which I then tweaked to the appropriate dimensions. Another procedural structure part was used to form the fuselage and act as a mount for the engine. But the jet engines in RP-1 actually include, the engine, not just the nozzle, so you need to have a fuselage wide enough to house it. I decided to use 2 structure parts here. The one I switched to smooth cone and made it big enough to enclose the engine, then ahead of that went another structure part set to regular cone and adjusted to smoothly make the transition to the cockpit. Next went on a pair of wings. Just like with my earlier prop trainer, I'm using the early procedural wings part. At this point, I'm just looking to get the shape approximately right before putting on the control surfaces. The control surfaces are again procedural parts, so expect to do a lot of tweaking. This first pair were ailerons, which I will tweak so that they are only responsible for roll. I'm making them a little less than half the length of the wing. I then copied and pasted this part to get me started on a pair of spoilers. I kept the length the same but adjusted the other parameters so that they fit into the wings smoothly. These had the pitch, yaw, and roll completely disabled, and then the spoiler activated, which toggles this control surface to the brakes. Then went on a third pair of control surfaces, this time with all the controls disabled, as this part was merely filling the space between the spoiler and the cockpit. On the wingtips, I put one more procedural wing part, tweaking down the size to give the wingtip a more finished look. These same parts were then used to fashion a tail. One thing I did a little differently this time was to place 2 control surfaces on the tail. The upper one set to remain rigid, while the lower one will act as a rudder and control the yaw of the craft. The elevators were then placed right at the transition between the 2 control surfaces on the tail, with control surfaces added and tweaked to control pitch. Once again, I'm just trying to get the shape looking right for now. There will be further tweaks once I start test flying. To finish off, on the tips of the rudder and elevators went some more tweaked down procedural wings. A jet needs fuel, so the fill feature was used to fill the wings with kerosene. The utilization was turned up to 25% to give me a decent delta V. I then built these pointy things under the wings. I totally don't know what they are, but I was able to fashion each of them out of a cubic strut and 3 procedural structure parts, 1 cylinder and 2 smooth cones. To save weight, the cylinder was set to be hollow and made as thin as I felt I could get away with. I then noticed that my center of lift was well in front of my center of mass, which would make this craft very unstable. At this point, I should probably be tweaking the lifting surfaces, perhaps sweeping the wings further back and or making the elevators bigger. But I realized that would mess up the control surfaces that I had spent all this time tweaking. Instead, I got lazy and replaced the structural piece between the intake and the cockpit with a fuel tank and filled it full of kerosene. I then used the utilization sliders on this tank and the wings to adjust the amount of fuel in each until the center of mass was just a little bit ahead of the center of lift. Many of you are likely guessing at the consequences of having a fuel tank so far from the center of mass of the craft, but I'll leave that discussion for later in the video. In hindsight, I'm also wondering, since I'm using the forward tank as ballast, perhaps I should have filled it with water or something. I think I could have done that. Next came the LY-10 small landing gear, 1 at the front with the brakes turned down to 20% and 2 at the back attached to the fuselage and moved out onto the wings with the steering disabled. And after tweaking the position so that the plane would sit nicely on the runway, it was time for the first simulation. Which I have to say I was pretty happy with for a first go. The takeoff speed's a little higher than I would like. There are a few things you can do to help with this, including lowering the forward landing gear so it will sit more pitched up on the runway, increasing the size of the elevators, especially the control surfaces back there. They do look rather small. You can also use the rotation tool to give the wings just a bit of an angle of attack. The important thing is that this plane had no trouble achieving the 15-kilometer altitude required for the milestone contract, and I couldn't resist going a little further to 16 kilometers just to get that red warning message. After this simulation, I did decide to turn the wings a bit and make the elevators bigger to give it more pitch authority. Then it was into the paint shop. Although you can make the procedural parts any color you like, there is unfortunately nothing you can do with the cockpit part. Though not part of RP-1, I may try installing the Simple Paint mod, which allows you to easily change the color of almost any part. Hopefully, that won't conflict with the recoloring GUI that comes with the procedural parts. I also took advantage of the wide variety of decals that are available. The changes allowed the craft to take off more easily, and was actually a pretty easy thing to fly. That said, a thing you quickly learn about RP-1 jets is that you can't fly them as abusively as you can in stock. Put too much stress on your parts and they will break off. One nice feature of the P-40 cockpit is that it comes with a built-in ejection seat. This is automatically toggled with the abort action group, so a simple strike of the backspace key ejects your Kerbal from the aircraft and, hopefully, to safety. Then came the most important test of all: can I land it? My first attempt taught me that landing anywhere other than the runway may not end well for you, as the plane completely went into shark mode. Of course, I restarted the simulation to try again and landed on the runway without any difficulty. At this point, I was pretty pleased, and after adding some Soviet stars that I found online, the plane was put into the building queue, and several months later, it was ready for its inaugural flight. Actually, we're going to turn around and go westward. That way, if anything goes wrong, we'll be over land instead of over the ocean. Remember, I do have a contract to achieve a crewed altitude record of 15 kilometers, which will earn me a little reputation. And the pilot that's going for that record is Evelyn Wolf. Evelyn was a co-pilot on each of the plane missions to date, but you never saw her because there was no IVA view for the second seat in that crew cabin. Once again, I'm using the cruise flight controller that comes with the AtmosphereAutopilot mod to control my ascent to the necessary 15-kilometer altitude. I wanted to keep my speed fairly constant during the ascent. If I noticed it dropping, I simply reduced the max climb angle accordingly. Okay, 5 degrees climb angle. Now we're picking up some speed, getting close to 15 kilometers. Of course, this is on. There we go. We gotta look at that way. Coming over Orlando, I believe. Well, there we go. That's our contract. 6 reputation for that. Nice and nice. Got this here, right? Yeah. Oh, we got more leaders. I didn't know that gave us more leaders. Vladimir, Yuri, Gagarin. Okay. That is sweet. Okay. Now, we are picking up some speed here, so that's nice. Yeah. Alright, let's just keep cruising at this altitude. We have a lot of fuel. Why not fly over to the Gulf Coast before we head back home? Maybe pay a little visit to the Tampa Bay area. I know a little bit about Florida. My parents, for about 10 years, summered in Florida until the drive started becoming too much for them. For those who don't know, I'm coming down from Ontario, Canada. They're not summered in Florida. Of course, they wintered in Florida. They're not crazy people. But, oh, is that a golf course down here? Or is that like Busch Gardens or something like that? But anyway, I do know the Tampa area a little bit because they wintered south of Tampa, near a town called Englewood, just a little south of Venice, and we used to come every summer pretty much for 10 years, or every summer, I keep saying that, every winter for about 10 years, and we brought the kids, drove down, brought the kids, stayed with my parents, and usually bought a double pass to go to Busch Gardens, and got very familiar with that park. A lot of fun. And while I was hoping for a nice leisurely fly, the plane had other ideas as soon thereafter the cruise controller began struggling with controlling the craft. Okay, I gotta take this off. Cut. Cut. Okay. SAS on. Damn. Right now, I'm thinking much more about getting out of this flat spin rather than thinking about what caused the problem in the first place. It seems no matter what I do, I just can't get the nose to point down, and with the benefit of a little hindsight, the reason is pretty obvious. As that tank at the front of the craft was draining, the center of mass was steadily moving aft on the vessel, until it was eventually behind the center of lift, at which point the craft became unstable. That ground is coming up quickly. No, we're too close. Eject. Oh, that hurts, but this pilot is much more valuable than the plane. Ooh, are we going to be able to see it hit here? Ooh. Yeah, thinking about it now, I probably could have started pumping fuel forward, and that probably would have helped, but we're late for that now. Thankfully, the contract did not require the safe return of the plane. Upon recovery, Evelyn's retirement date only got pushed back 7 days. Future flights hardly seem worthwhile, but I returned to the hangar and got to work trying to make this plane more stable anyway. I even began trying to wrap my head around the stability derivatives provided by Ferram Aerospace. I can't claim to be an expert, but I gotta assume a lot of red is bad. I replaced that forward tank with a structural part, put more fuel into the wings, and continued trying to balance the plane better. Looking at this now, I think making the fuselage a little longer may help with stability. Either way, despite getting the analysis looking considerably better, I decided to put this aside for now and leave it as a topic for a future video. I hope to see you then.